A wild canine, a German shepherd, appeared out of nowhere and walked straight toward an elderly woman in a wheelchair. Everyone expected him to attack or run away, but what he did next left everyone speechless. This story will change the way you see loyalty and fate. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss our most inspiring and heartwarming stories. Your support helps us share these incredible tales with the world. The town of Maple Ridge was a quiet place nestled between endless stretches of forest and rolling hills. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where doors were left unlocked, and where nothing truly exciting ever happened. At least, not until the wild German shepherd appeared. For weeks, people whispered about the massive black and tan canine that roamed the outskirts of town, slipping between the trees like a shadow. No one knew where he had come from, but his presence unnerved the locals. Some claimed he had once belonged to the police or military, a retired canine abandoned and left to survive on his own. Others believed he was just another stray, hardened by a life in the wild. But one thing was certain, he never let anyone get too close. No matter how many times people tried to approach him, he always stayed just out of reach, watching and waiting like he was searching for something. One afternoon, as the sun cast long golden rays over the town, the German shepherd emerged from the woods again. But this time, he wasn't hiding. He was moving with purpose, and his destination was Eleanor Whitmore. Eleanor had lived in Maple Ridge her entire life. At 78 years old, she had seen the town change in ways she never expected. Her husband had passed away years ago. Her children had moved far away, and her world had become smaller with each passing year. But she never complained. Instead, she sat on her front porch every evening in her old wooden wheelchair, wrapped in a faded blue shawl, watching the world go by. Today was no different. She adjusted the blanket over her lap, sighing as she watched the neighborhood kids play down the street. A part of her longed to join them, to feel the freedom of running again, but those days were gone. Then she saw him, the German shepherd. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her, but as she blinked, he was still there, standing at the edge of her yard. His golden brown eyes locked onto hers. Eleanor's breath hitched. She had heard the stories. People warned that the dog was dangerous and unpredictable. Some had even called for animal control to remove him from the area. But looking into his eyes now, she didn't see danger. She saw sadness. The shepherd took a cautious step forward, his massive paws pressing against the grass. His ears flicked slightly, his posture neither aggressive nor fearful, just curious. Eleanor's heart pounded. She had always loved dogs, but after her accident and losing the ability to walk, she had convinced herself that having a pet was too much responsibility. But now, sitting in her wheelchair, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Slowly and carefully, she lifted her hand. The dog froze. His muscles tensed. His ears pricked forward. And then he moved, not with hesitation or fear, but with absolute purpose. He crossed the yard, stopping just inches away from her. His warm breath ghosted over her fingers. Eleanor held still, barely breathing. And then, the impossible happened. The shepherd lowered his massive head and gently pressed his forehead against the palm. A quiet gasp escaped her lips. He wasn't just accepting her presence. He was seeking comfort. For a long moment, they stayed like that, an old woman in a wheelchair and a wild dog that no one could tame. And as Eleanor stroked the thick fur between his ears, she knew one thing for certain. He had chosen her. Eleanor's fingers trembled as they ran through the thick fur of the wild German shepherd, resting his head against her hand. He wasn't just tolerating her touch. He was seeking it. The same dog that had evaded the entire town, that had slipped into the shadows the moment anyone got too close, was now standing before her, completely still. For a moment, Eleanor forgot about her wheelchair, forgot about the years of solitude. All she could focus on was the warmth of the shepherd's fur and the way his deep brown eyes looked up at her, not with fear or aggression, but with something she hadn't seen in years. Trust. She swallowed hard, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Where did you come from?" she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. The dog's ears flicked at the sound of her voice. He didn't move away. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment, waiting for her. The weight of that realization settled in her chest. For years, she had felt invisible, forgotten. People passed by with polite smiles, offering help she didn't want, but never truly seeing her. Yet this wild canine, this untamed, lonely creature, had noticed her, and somehow that meant more than anything. The sound of tires rolling over gravel shattered the moment. Eleanor looked up just in time to see her neighbor, Mr. Calloway, stepping out his truck. He was a gruff, middle-aged man who prided himself on keeping the neighborhood safe, judging by the scowl on his face. He didn't like what he was seeing. "You need to get inside, Eleanor," he called out, his voice laced with warning. "That's the stray everyone's been talking about." The German shepherd tensed, his ears flattened slightly, but he didn't move away from Eleanor. She could feel it, the shift in his energy. He wasn't scared. He was protecting her. Mr. Calloway took another step closer. "That dog's dangerous. Animal control was out here last week trying to catch him. No luck. That thing's wild." Eleanor's grip on the shepherd tightened. She could feel the slow, steady rise and fall of his breathing beneath her fingers. "He's not dangerous," she said firmly. Mr. Calloway scoffed. "You don't know that. He's probably sick. Who knows what kind of diseases a stray like that carries?" Eleanor's jaw clenched. She looked down at the shepherd, who hadn't taken his eyes off Mr. Calloway. Not in a threatening way, but in a way that made it clear he wasn't going anywhere. "He's not a stray," Eleanor said, her voice steady now. "He's mine." Mr. Calloway stared at her like she had lost her mind. "You can't just claim a wild animal, Eleanor." She lifted her chin. "Watch me." For a long moment there was silence. The shepherd, as if sensing the shift in the conversation, finally relaxed just slightly. Mr. Calloway let out a heavy sigh, shaking his head. "You're too trusting. That dog's gonna turn on you one day." Eleanor knew he was wrong, but she didn't argue. Instead, she simply looked down at the German shepherd, running her fingers gently over his ears. "You're staying with me now," she murmured. The dog exhaled deeply, as if he'd been waiting to hear those words. And just like that, Eleanor wasn't alone anymore. The German shepherd stayed close to Eleanor's side as Mr. Calloway muttered something under his breath and walked away. His truck door slammed shut, and moments later, he was gone. But the tension in the air remained. Eleanor let out a slow breath and looked down at the wild canine that had chosen her. He was still watching the road, his body alert, muscles tight, as if he was ready to defend her if needed. She stroked his fur, feeling the ridges of his spine beneath her fingers. He wasn't just any stray. He was trained. He belonged to someone, or at least, he used to. Eleanor felt a pang of sadness at the thought. She had spent years feeling like she didn't belong anywhere anymore. Maybe he felt the same. She let her fingers brush over his ear. "You need a name," she murmured. His ear twitched, but he didn't move. Eleanor thought for a moment, then smiled softly. "How about Shadow?" The German shepherd's eyes flicked up to hers. He blinked once slowly, a silent understanding. It felt right. She ran her hand along his back again. "Shadow it is." And just like that, he was no longer a nameless, forgotten creature. He was hers. The next morning, Eleanor woke to the sound of paws pacing across her porch. For the first time in years, she wasn't waking up to an empty house. She wheeled herself outside, and there he was, Shadow, sitting at attention by her chair. His dark eyes locked onto her, as if waiting for instructions. She chuckled. "You really aren't going anywhere, are you?" His ears perked up slightly. Eleanor wheeled closer and reached out, running a hand over his fur. He leaned into the touch, and she smiled. "Well, if you're staying, we better make sure you're taken care of." She had no leash, no collar, but Shadow followed her without hesitation as she made her way to the shed at the side of the house. Inside, she rummaged through an old wooden chest filled with her late husband's belongings. Her fingers brushed against something soft, and she pulled it out, a worn leather collar, the metal buckle rusted but still strong. It had belonged to Max, the dog she and her husband had raised before the accident that left her in this wheelchair. Shadow stared at the collar, then at her. Eleanor hesitated. Would you wear this? A moment of silence. Then Shadow lowered his head. Her heart clenched. With careful hands, she fastened the collar around his neck. It fit perfectly. As she looked at him now, sitting there in the soft morning light, wearing a symbol of the life she had lost, Eleanor felt something inside her shift. She wasn't alone anymore, and neither was he. Shadow had settled into life with Eleanor faster than she ever could have imagined. Every morning, he would sit patiently on the porch, waiting for her to wake up. He followed her around the yard, never straying too far, always watching, always alert. It was clear to Eleanor that this dog had been trained for something far more than just surviving in the wild. But where had he come from, and why had he chosen her? She couldn't shake the feeling that Shadow's past was still out there, waiting to catch up to him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Eleanor sat on her porch, wrapped in her shawl, while Shadow lay at her feet. The quiet was comforting until it wasn't. A car was coming. The low hum of an engine broke the stillness of the evening. Eleanor tensed as she saw a dark SUV roll slowly down the street, its headlights off. Shadow's head snapped up. His ears perked. Then he growled, a deep, guttural sound that sent chills down Eleanor's spine. She had never heard him make a noise like that before. He stood, muscles tight, eyes locked on the approaching vehicle. Eleanor's pulse quickened. Something wasn't right. The SUV crawled to a stop in front of her house. The windows were tinted, impossible to see inside. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the driver's side door opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothing. His movements were careful, deliberate, like someone trained. Shadow stood rigid, his stance shifting slightly, as if preparing for something. Eleanor gripped the arms of her wheelchair. "Can I help you?" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. The man stopped at the edge of her yard. His gaze flicked to Shadow, sharp, assessing. Then finally he spoke. "That dog," he said. "Where did you find him?" Eleanor's stomach twisted. Shadow let out another low growl, stepping protectively in front of her. She squared her shoulders. "He found me." The man exhaled sharply, his eyes never leaving the dog. "You don't understand," he said. "That's not just any dog." He paused, then reached into his pocket. Shadow lunged forward, not attacking, but warning. Eleanor's heart pounded. The man froze, then slowly pulled out a badge. "Military," he said. "My name is Officer Daniels. And that dog, his name isn't Shadow. It's Titan." Eleanor blinked. "Titan?" Daniels nodded. "He's a former military K-9. He's been missing for almost a year." Eleanor's breath caught. Shadow, Titan, glanced between them, ears flicking back. He recognized the name, but didn't move toward the officer. Instead, he stayed by Eleanor's side. Daniels frowned. "Ma'am, you don't understand. This dog, he's one of the best we ever trained. He belonged to a special forces unit. Then, on his last mission, things went wrong. The helicopter crashed. Titan was lost in the wilderness. We thought he was dead." Eleanor's chest tightened. Shadow had been through so much. But as she looked at him now, standing protectively by her chair, she knew one thing for certain. He had found a new purpose with her, and she wasn't ready to let him go. Eleanor's hands tightened around the arms of her wheelchair as she absorbed Officer Daniels' words. Shadow, Titan, wasn't just a lost dog. He was a soldier. She looked down at him. The powerful frame of the K-9 German shepherd who had chosen her, protected her, and comforted her. Now, someone had come to take him away. Shadow didn't move. He didn't step toward Daniels. He didn't acknowledge the badge or the name. His stance remained firm next to Eleanor. She swallowed hard. "So what happens now?" Daniels sighed, shifting uncomfortably. "I need to bring him back. He's government property." Eleanor's heart clenched. Property? She stroked Shadow's fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing beneath her touch. This wasn't just an animal. This was a soul. "You make it sound like he's a weapon," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Daniels hesitated. "He saved Dubes. He's trained to protect, to fight, but he's more than that. He's loyal, and that's why I'm here." Eleanor frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniel sighed. We thought Titan was lost. We searched for him for months, but no one could find him. Then reports started coming in. Sightings of a large K9 in the wild, avoiding people, keeping his distance. He didn't trust anyone. Eleanor glanced down at Shadow. She could see it now. The caution, the way he watched the world with quiet calculation. He survived alone. Daniels continued. Through the elements, through dangers most animals wouldn't last a month in. But even after all that, he came to you. Eleanor's throat tightened. Daniels took a careful step closer. I don't think that was a coincidence. Shadow let out a low growl, not aggressive, but a warning. Eleanor's jaw clenched. I won't force him to go. If you're telling me he's a soldier, then he should get to choose his own fate. Daniels exhaled. That's not how this works. A pause. Then he reached into his pocket again, pulling out a small metal tag. He held it up, letting the fading sunlight glint off the worn edges. This was his. Eleanor's breath caught as she saw the engraving. Titan K9 unit. Shadow's ears flicked at the sound of the tag clinking softly in the air. His body tense. He recognized it. Daniels crouched slightly, extending the tag toward Shadow. Titan, he called, voice steady. Come. Eleanor held her breath. For the first time, Shadow hesitated. His muscles twitched, his ears flicking between Daniels and Eleanor. A choice. Daniels softened his tone. Come on, boy. Let's go home. Shadow took a slow step forward. Eleanor's chest ached. She clenched her hands into fists, bracing herself for the inevitable. Then Shadow stopped. He turned his head, his deep brown eyes locking onto hers. Eleanor's home wasn't the past. It was here. Eleanor blinked back the sudden sting of tears. Shadow, you don't have to go. Daniels exhaled, running a hand down his face. He had seen dogs trained for war, trained for loyalty, but what he was witnessing now, this wasn't training. This was a bond, one that even duty couldn't break. Shadow walked back to Eleanor, pressing his head against her leg. Daniel sighed. Well, I guess that settles it. Eleanor swallowed hard. What does that mean? Daniels gave her a long look. It means maybe Titan isn't lost anymore. He stood up, slipping the tag back into his pocket. I'll report that he was found, but he's not fit for duty anymore. Eleanor's breath hitched. You do that. Daniel shrugged. Titan made his choice. A pause. Then he gave Shadow one last look. Take care of her, Daniel said. Shadow let out a small huff, as if acknowledging the unspoken words between them. Daniels nodded, stepping back toward his SUV. As he opened the door, he glanced at Eleanor one last time. You might not know it, but he saved your life, too. Eleanor smiled softly. I think we saved each other. Daniels gave a small nod, then got into his car and drove away. Eleanor ran her hand over Shadow's fur. Looks like you're staying, boy. Shadow let out a soft, content sigh and lay down beside her chair. He wasn't Titan anymore. He was Shadow, and he was finally home. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that only small towns could offer. The distant chirp of crickets and the rustling of trees in the breeze were the only sounds breaking the silence. Eleanor sat in her usual spot on the porch, wrapped in her favorite blue shawl. But tonight, everything felt different. Shadow lay stretched out beside her wheelchair, his thick fur illuminated by the golden glow of the porch light. He looked peaceful, but Eleanor could tell his ears were always listening, his body always ready. She reached down, brushing her fingers over his head. He had made his choice. The past few days had been a whirlwind of emotions. Officer Daniels had given her the chance to let Shadow go back to his old life, to return to the world of discipline, training, and duty, but Shadow had chosen her instead. Eleanor sighed, shifting slightly in her chair. You're a stubborn one, aren't you? Shadow let out a soft huff, his warm brown eyes flicking up to meet hers. She chuckled. Yeah, I thought so. It had been so long since she had felt needed, since the accident that took her ability to walk. She had convinced herself that she was just existing, that she had lost her purpose. But now, with Shadow by her side, she wasn't just existing anymore. She was living. The next morning, Eleanor wheeled herself to the town square, Shadow walking proudly beside her. People stared. Some whispered. Others crossed the street, watching the massive German shepherd with suspicion. Eleanor knew what they were thinking. That's the stray, the dangerous dog, the one they tried to catch for months. She held her head high anyway. Shadow stayed close, his posture calm but alert. He wasn't just following her, he was guarding her. Mr. Calloway, the same neighbor who had tried to warn her about Shadow, stood by his truck, arms crossed. He watched as she rolled past, his eyes narrowing at the dog beside her. Eleanor smiled. "Morning, Mr. Calloway." He grunted. "You're still keeping that thing around?" Eleanor patted Shadow's head. "You mean my best friend?" "Yes, I am." Calloway scoffed. "You're going to regret it." Eleanor just kept smiling. "Funny, I was about to say the same to you." As she rolled away, she heard him mutter something under his breath. But she didn't care. Shadow had already proven himself to her, and soon he would prove himself to everyone else too. Later that afternoon, Eleanor sat outside the Maple Ridge Community Center, where she volunteered once a week. Shadow rested beside her, his massive body stretched out, but his ears flicked at every sound. Inside, the center was bustling, kids laughing, parents chatting, the sound of sneakers squeaking against the hardwood floor. But Eleanor wasn't paying attention to that. She was watching a little girl sitting alone on the front steps. She recognized her immediately, Emily Carter. Emily was only 7 years old, but she had already been through more pain than most adults. Her father had passed away last year, and ever since, she barely spoke. She just sat quietly, watching the world move around her without joining in. Eleanor's heart ached for her. Without thinking, she gently tapped Shadow's side. "Go to her," she whispered. Shadow stood immediately, his ears perking. Then, slowly, he walked toward Emily. The little girl didn't look up at first. Shadow stopped a foot away from her, waiting. Eleanor held her breath. Then, after what felt like forever, Emily lifted her head. Her big blue eyes locked onto the German shepherd in front of her. Shadow lowered his head, ears slightly back, not in fear, but in a quiet invitation. Emily hesitated. Then, slowly, she reached out. Shadow didn't move. She ran her tiny fingers over his fur just once, then twice, and finally, she buried her face in his thick coat and sobbed. Eleanor swallowed the lump in her throat as she watched the scene unfold. Shadow didn't pull away. He let the little girl cry into his fur, standing perfectly still as if he knew she had been holding it all in for too long. And Eleanor knew at that moment that Shadow's journey wasn't just about finding a home. He had found a purpose, not as a soldier, not as a stray, but as a friend. That evening, as Eleanor and Shadow made their way home, she couldn't help but smile. She stroked his head. "You're going to change lives, you know that?" Shadow let out a soft woof, pressing his cold nose against her palm. Eleanor laughed. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of what tomorrow would bring because she wouldn't be facing it alone. Eleanor sat on her porch. Shadow curled at her feet. The world had changed, or maybe she had. He wasn't stray anymore. He wasn't lost. He had found her, and she had found him. She stroked his fur, whispering, "We saved each other, didn't we?" Shadow let out a soft sigh, nuzzling into her hand. No more running. No more fear. Just home.